Welcome to the Smathers Library, especially at the Special and Area Study collection. In commemoration of 400th Shakespeare's death, I'm honored to introduce Professor SidHoman to you. Professor Homan received his BA from Princeton University in 1960. His MA and a PhD in English from Harvard University in 1965. Before coming to UF, he taught English at the University of Illinois from 1965 through 1969. At that time, I was the young librarian at Northern Illinois University, and I use University of Illinois libraries all the time. And he taught at the University of Illinois and Boston University, 1969 and 1972. He has been professor of English at UF since 1973. And a visiting professor at Jilin University in the People's Republic of China. Professor Hauptmann is an actor, director in commercial and university theaters. He is also an award-winning teacher several times. He authored 10 books on Shakespeare and modern theater criticism. I brought all his publication on this table here. After the lecture, you may want to take a look of his publication here, okay? I lost my place. In modern, where his interests range from meta-dramatic to performance criticism, from the way in which the triple play can be executed from study to stage, to classroom, to accounts of his own experience as actor and director in professional, experimental, and university theater. His prize-winning books, Bucket's Theaters, emerging from a production of Waiting for Godot that toured Florida's 10 state prisons. Today, Professor Hauptmann's presentation is based on his 2 performance studies, appearing in 2004, Directing Shakespeare, a Scholar on Stage, and a Staging Modern Playwrights, from director's concept to performance. After the lecture, please take a few minutes visiting our library exhibit in the gallery outside the grand reading room. The items in the exhibition were selected from the Special and Area Studies collection and also Library West. Books on exhibit are only a few representative samples by famous illustrators, fine presses, rare items which special interest in mind to researchers, faculty, and the students. In conjunction with this exhibit, we also have an exhibit in Library West entitled Shakespeare in Film. If you are interested, you can visit that exhibit in the second floor, main lobby. Without further ado, let me have Professor Hauptmann.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you so much. Well, you know, I think it's, on one hand, quite proper to talk about Shakespeare here in the library, and I want to make an argument for that. I want to try to show, at least in 2 of my examples, how work as a scholar can influence your work in the theater and vice versa. But of course, it's also a little ironic to talk about Shakespeare in the library, isn't it? I mean, he never could imagine that there'd be a whole section, 822.33, devoted to his plays and the whole Shakespeare industry. You know, only half of his plays were published in his lifetime, and usually when a corrupt edition, an unauthorized edition came out, and then Shakespeare's company would put out the authorized edition. The actor who played the nurse, for example, in Romeo and Juliet in 1595, probably went to an illegal printer and told the printer as much of the scenes as he could remember. We know it was a nurse because in the 4 scenes where the nurse is present, the scenes are reported fairly accurately. You know, if you've been in the theater, you've been in a scene, you tend to know the lines of all the other actors in the scene. And then what Shakespeare's company did was, of course, brought out the authorized edition of Romeo and Juliet, forcing the unauthorized edition off. So it never would occur to him, it seems to me, to publish his plays. They weren't even his plays. They belonged to the company. So the idea that here we are, hundreds of years later, and I'm talking about Shakespeare in the library is a little ironic. It's something I've had to deal with all the time. My first day as a young assistant professor at Illinois, I went to pay my respects to a very distinguished senior Shakespearean who was retiring. I mean, I was the assistant professor with 1 article to my credit, and here I was, and so he told me, his secretary told me I could come to his office at 3 o'clock, and I was there at 1 minute of 3, waiting to knock on the door, and at exactly at 3, I knocked on the door, and I heard this voice, a sort of Alfred Hitchcock voice, say, "Come in." And I go in, and there was a long rectangular room with books on both sides. He was at the far end with his back to me, looking out the window. And I introduced myself, and we started to have a very strained conversation, but he wouldn't turn around and face me. And I figured, oh, this is just the senior Shakespearean putting the young guy in his place. And so I tried to get him to turn around. I started to flatter him. As Professor so-and-so, you've written so many extraordinary books on Shakespeare. Surely, I said, in your lifetime, you've seen hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of productions of Shakespeare. That did it. When I said that, he turned around, his face sort of flushed, a dour look on his face, and he said to me, I quote him exactly, this was 1965. I've never forgotten it. Mr. Homan, not even Assistant Professor Homan, Mr. Homan, I've never seen a production of Shakespeare. Why, Professor so-and-so? His answer, because I would never want any mere actor or director to ruin my ideal conception of the playwright. I did my best to get out of that conversation, and about 5 days later, some other young guys and I, who all had worked in the theater, we were commiserating because we had been rejected by the theater department. We went over to the theater department saying, hey, can you use this? We like to act, and it was a closed shop. No, we only take people in our own department. And we got very angry, and we got a little drunk. And we staggered through the worst section of Champaign that night, and we came upon an abandoned train depot. It used to be a passenger depot, but now it stopped, no longer stopped there. And I found out we could rent the theater for $100 a month. And it was one of those wonderful old 19th century train stations, with the great carved wooden benches. And it became the Depot Theater. And I made up my mind from that day on. I've been working in the theater since I was 5. You're looking at a singer on the Magic Lady Radio Hour, station WIP, Philadelphia, and a dancer on American Bandstand. But that's another story. But I made up my mind that from then on, I would continue to blend my work in the classroom and as a would-be scholar with my work in the theater. The title of this lecture today, actually there's an irony there too. The title is, of course, Directing Shakespeare, a Scholar on Stage. And in that book, I used as my text plays I've directed, my experience directing plays. I submitted it to a press. The press that had published 6 or 7 of my books. Now, of course, Every time you submit a book, you're starting anew, you know. But I got it, the book was rejected. And the rejections were interesting. One of the readers who rejected it said, this is too anecdotal, but more damaging. The other reader said, this book is too much based on real life experience. I went home to my wife, Norma, and she said, well, what are you going to do about this? I said, this is the only type of book I want to write, so let's just throw it away. But I discovered there's a sort of underground railroad among university presses. And I got a call from a press, and they said, we heard that your book was rejected by so-and-so. And I said, yeah, well, I know a press that likes books based upon personal experience. And so it came out from Ohio University Press. What I want to talk about today, I want to talk about 3 examples. In the first and third one, there are instances in which scholarship, in the first case, a scholar who totally made something out of the air. And in the second one, a scholar who noticed something very specific in Hamlet. I want to talk about 2 instances in which scholarship really influenced what I did as a director in the theater. And then in the middle example, I want to talk about a student to whom I gave an assignment. He was going to play Shylock. And he came to me with the question, Sid, how do I play Shylock? And as any director would do, I said, I can't tell you how to play Shylock. You're going to have to discover that with your director and with yourself. But that question led to something very interesting, I think. The first example, you know that wonderful moment in King Lear? King Lear comes in with Cordelia in his arms. She's wearing her military doublet, her attempt to liberate the country from her 2 bad sisters. Ronald Reagan has failed. She's dead. Lear, the 80-year-old man, comes holding his daughter like that, and he tries to check and see if she's alive. He puts a feather by her nose. He puts a glass up to her mouth to see if the breath would stain it. He concludes she's dead. Why should a dog, a horse, a rat have life and thou no life at all? And then there's an extraordinary moment. Here's the text from the folio edition. He says, as he's holding the daughter, he says, pray you, sir, undo this button. We generally take that in the theater as meaning Lear is about to have a heart attack, and Elizabethans believe when you had a heart attack, your heart blew up. And so his heart is straining underneath his own costume. Pray you, sir, undo this button. Whoever he addresses, it could be Kent, who, by the way, you remember had disguised himself as a servant, or it could just be a servant on stage. Pray you, sir, undo this button. The servant must do that. And Lear says, thank you, sir. If it's a servant, that would be odd. Normally you would call a servant Sirrah. The way pre-Civil War Southerners would refer to African Americans as boy. It's a sort of denigrating name. But Lear calls him sir. And one can make a bit of this. I mean, this is the proud king from Act 1, now humbled. Praise her. Thank you, sir. And then Lear has some interesting lines. He says, do you see this? Look on her. Look. Her lips. Her lips. Look on her. Look. What does he see? I mean, she's dead. In his state, does he see her lips move? Is he having a vision beyond tragedy? I mean, that's how the romantic Shakespeareans would interpret it. But Marvin Rosenberg, a wonderful scholar who wrote a series of books called The Mask of Othello, The Mask of King Lear, books which trace the performance history of the plays. I was talking to him one day and he said, you know, Sid, I found a scholar who a couple centuries ago, who suggested that he saw a copy of the folio. Now, we don't have this copy, so he could have been just making it up. A copy of the folio that when Lear says, thank you, sir, there's a line saying, Cordelia, A-H. And then Lear says, do you see this? Cordelia's dead, but sometimes he saw the line, ah. I have no way to, I've never discovered that in any of the copies of Shakespeare that we have, but the scholar insisted that there was an ah there. I just filed that in the back of my mind. And then I began thinking, what about if when when Lear says, pray you, sir, undo this button, thank you, sir, what about if instead of asking that the button on his costume be undone, but rather, since Cordelia is being held in his arms like that, he's concerned because her neck, it's pulling against her neck. And now I'm being very fanciful, but the servant instead undoes the button. Lear's not concerned about himself, but concerned about his daughter, that when the servant undoes the button, her neck can relax. I love that notion that the father, holding the dead child, is still solicitous, concerned about her. And what came into my mind was, of all things, it happened in rehearsal, was that iconic picture from the Vietnam War. Do you remember the mother holding her daughter who had been killed by a napalm bomb? And the mother is combing the hair of the dead daughter. The notion that the love of a parent would extend even beyond life. I had that in my mind. And then something else came into my mind when we were rehearsing this scene. When I was 11 years old, I was sitting with my grandfather, who was a Philadelphia character, in front of his row house on Broad Street, and people would pass by and say hello to my grandfather, and he was very old. And while I was sitting next to him, he turned to me and he said, he was a Cockney, he said, "It's been beautiful, Sonny." That was his word for beautiful. "It's been beautiful, Sonny." And then he said to me, "Sonny, help me in." He wanted to go inside to this sort of sitting room, which faced the street. I helped the old man into the room. He said, "Help me down, lie down." I helped him lie down on the cot. And in a couple of minutes, I realized he was dead. It wasn't terrifying to me. It was rather peaceful. And then something extraordinary happened. As he was lying there dead, he went, ah. I would later find out from physician friends that this sometimes happens, that air trapped in the lungs makes its way out. And you can hear this, ah. Well, boy, I had that experience with my grandfather in my brain. I had that wonderful, probably misguided scholar who was sure that Cordelia had an ah. And, you know, I can't add any words to Shakespeare's text. That's cheating, right? We cut Shakespeare's text all the time, and directors won't admit that. You don't cut Hamlet, it runs 4 hours. And I've cut it. I'm guilty of that. But I've never added a word. But I thought about, and then the scholar in me came in. What about if that scholar was right, that she does say ah, and so as the doublet's released, ah, the sound of breath, the source of speech. All this from the young girl you remember at the beginning of the play. Lear turns to Goneril and Regan, "How much do you love me?" They give him pat political speeches, and he turns to Cordelia. Now, in an aside, she's told us, "My love for my father is so great that I cannot heave my heart into my tongue. What hast thou to say, my youngest and my dearest, that thou can draw a third more ample than your sisters?" That's interesting. I thought he had divided the kingdom into 3 equal parts. But Cordelia is not only his youngest and dearest, but if she gives him the right response, telling him how much she loves him, she'll get a third more ample. Oh boy, if you're playing Goneril and Regan, I mean, what are you thinking about that, you know? And of course, what hast thou to say? That there was a third more ample than yours? And of course, Cordelia's wonderful line is, "Nothing, my lord." Nothing? Nothing, my lord. Because we know that her word nothing is not quantity but quality. Her love is so profound that she cannot heave her heart into her mouth. We know that. But he doesn't. He takes it as quantity. Then nothing will come of nothing. And of course, you know what happens. He banishes her from his kingdom, and 3 hours later, after staggering about the wild English heath and losing his mind and exposing himself to all the poor of the earth, he finally, at the end, reunites with Cordelia. What a wonderful touch it might be if that girl who said nothing earlier in the play, now her last word, if you will, is a sound of breath. I did a production of King Lear, and my son David, who's a musician and composer, David composed a score for the production. The musicians were on stage and they played constantly. In other words, it wasn't background music. It was sort of like a Greek chorus with the music reiterating themes and anticipating things, sort of continuous music. And that was rather interesting because the actors and I learned how to deliver the iambic pentameter in terms of the beat of the music. But at that moment, when Lear says, "Thank you, sir," the musician stopped, and the actors, without any other sound, echoed over the theater. There was a young master's candidate in a theater department some years back, came to me. He was about to play Shylock in The Merchant of Venice. How appropriate for this room. And he came in and said to me, "Sid, how do I play Shylock?" And I said, "Keith, I'm not going to answer that. You don't tell an actor how to play it. You're going to find your Shylock." "No, come on, Sid." I said, "I can't do that." He said, "Well, okay, tell me the extremes to be avoided. Would you do that?" So I said, okay. I saw a production at the New Jersey Shakespeare Festival a couple years ago where Shylock was an absolute villain. And in this post-Holocaust age, the audience practically booed the production from the stage. He said, "You said there was another extreme." I said, "Yes, I saw a production at the University of Maine one summer, and Shylock was the martyred victim of a vicious Christian majority, complete with the sound of jackboots and swastikas, the harmless, the slaughtered lamb, if I can mix religions." And I said, the audience, an intelligent audience, was bored to death. So he said, "What would it be, somewhere in between?" I said, "I don't know." He said, "Well, tell me, give me something to do." I said, "Okay, go back to your room, look at your script again, and tell me something, come back in a couple days, and tell me something that you discovered that just sort of struck you. You don't have to make sense of it, just something odd." He comes back in a couple of days. "I found something, Sid." I said, "What is it?" Typical of an actor. He said, "You know that scene where Shylock's associate Tubal comes with bad news? Shylock's daughter has married a Christian, taken all his money, eloped, with Lorenzo, thrown all his gold bags off the balcony, etc. like that. And Shylock goes into a rant. How raised his daughter? I would that you were buried in a coffin. My ducats, my daughter. My ducats, my." This is very much in the tradition of the comic Jew villain of the Elizabethan stage, and that. Of course, anti-Semitic age. And then, just when Shylock is enraged at this, Tubal gives him some good news. "Oh, but by the way, all of Antonio's ships have sunk. He can't possibly pay back the 3,000. Now Shylock's happy." So Shylock goes back and forth between grief and happiness, It's sad, but it's also comic. And again, it's very much in tradition of the sort of ranting, raving, melodramatic comic Jew of the Elizabethan theater. Check out, for example, Marlowe's The Jew of Malta. And then Tubal says something interesting. "By the way, I hear it reported that she took a ring of yours and sold it and bought a monkey with it." Elizabethan wealthy women have this affectation of walking down the streets of London with a monkey on a leash. She sold a ring of Shylock's pawned it for a monkey. Listen to Shylock's response. My turquoise, I had it of Leah when I was a bachelor. I would not have given a world of monkeys for it. I said, well, what's odd about this, Keith? He said, well, first of all, there's no Mrs. Shylock in the play. Why would Shakespeare give a name to someone who doesn't appear? There's no, and you don't need a ring, a turquoise ring, on the props table. So a reference to a woman who exists before the play and an object. My turquoise, I had it at Leah when I was a bachelor. I said, what about this? And what Keith did was, it took us hours to get this out. Here's what he came up with. He said, the Christian majority in Venice only wants Shylock as a moneylender, which was the situation in London. They weren't interested in him as a person. When Leah died, no one sent sympathy cards. They weren't interested in Shylock's domestic life. His only relationship with them was as the moneylender. The Christians could not be bankers in that sense. They needed Jews to handle money. And yet, the fact is that Shylock was once loved by a woman named Leah. Jessica was a product of that union. And Leah, as a symbol of her love, gave Shylock a turquoise, not an expensive stone, but a turquoise. And whatever we think of Shylock, whatever the biases of the Elizabethan audiences were when they entered the Globe 1598 to see that play, suddenly there's a whole human dimension of Shylock. And Keith's take on this was that while Shylock is villainous in the sense that he demands a pound of flesh, there's also a deeply human dimension to him. And in this way, he is not unlike the Christians. They too were loved by a woman. So he had a sort of Shylock who was a mixture of these two qualities. I always find it interesting that when Portia, disguised as a male lawyer, comes into Shylock's trial, of course this would be a boy actor playing a woman, playing a male lawyer, there stands Shylock and there stands Antonio. Shylock in Shakespeare's day would probably have a prosthetic nose, confirming to Jewish stereotypes. He would certainly have a gabardine, a yarmulke. That is, he clearly looks like the Jew. But Portia, isn't this interesting? Portia says, seeing Antonio and Shylock standing together, Antonio would be costumed as an Elizabethan merchant. Portia says, which is the merchant and which the Jew? And very often on stage, everyone else on stage will laugh. Can't you tell a Jew? Which is the merchant? Which is the Jew? It strikes me that her question gets us something very deeper in the play, something I love about Shakespeare, something, if I can be just political for a tiny moment, just a moment. I love to say, sometimes especially to freshman students, I think Shakespeare was a Democrat. Look at this. Look at this. Look at this. In an anti-Semitic age, where that audience comes into the Globe hating Jews, they were the killers of the baby Jesus. They were people who were useful only as money lenders. No one was interested in their private lives. Shakespeare asked them to consider this one man. As he asked them, by the way, a little later, to consider what about a marriage between a black, middle-aged pagan and a young white Christian girl in Othello. Shakespeare is not only the best playwright of the age, but it strikes me his sympathies are so wide. James Calderwood, a wonderful scholar, no longer with us, wrote a marvelous book called Negation and Metadrama in Hamlet. And in that book, Calderwood points out something which may or may not be of significance. But I have a bad habit as a director of making a lot out of things which may or may not be true. The messenger who brings a letter to Claudius and Gertrude in Act 4, Scene 7 from Hamlet. And the message, you know, from Hamlet is, Claudius, I'm back. Boy, do I have things to tell you. Of course, you know, Hamlet now knows that Claudius planned to have Rosencrantz and Guildenstern give a letter to the king, and when the English king got it, the English king would then execute Hamlet on the spot. But of course, Hamlet opened up, you know all the plot, Hamlet opened up the letter while they were asleep on ship deck, erased his name, put their name, you got it. And Tom Stoppard would play on this centuries later. Oh, okay. A letter from Claudius to Claudius and to Gertrude. And a messenger brings the letters on stage, an anonymous messenger. But the messenger informs us that he got this message from another messenger whose name was, Claudio. And Calderwood starts speculating on why would Shakespeare name this messenger who never makes it to the stage Claudius. Couldn't he have called him something else? Why something so close? And Calderwood begins speculating and speculating, and his thesis is, and I'm reading this in Library West, reading this book, about to direct Hamlet. And Calderwood speculates, Hamlet in a way is a messenger. He's told by his father, played by by Shakespeare, as you know, Hamlet Sr. He's told by his father, kill Claudius, leave your mother's soul to heaven. That's it. Don't give 7 complicated soliloquies raising existential, philosophical, theological reasons for why you should take revenge or why not. You know, one of the things I discovered as a graduate student was well, it started as an undergraduate. When I was an undergraduate, my first Shakespeare course, among other things we had to read, was that essay by T.S. Eliot called The Problem with Hamlet, where Eliot, you know, argues the play's a failure because Shakespeare doesn't give us enough, I'm using Eliot's terms, objective correlatives. He means something like what we would mean by a metaphor, you know, an object which is significant of something else. So the example I always use with my students, my wife's lips are beautiful. By the way, I'm going to give you an invitation from Norm in a few minutes. My wife's lips are beautiful, but the word beautiful is too sloppy. So I say my wife's lips are rose petals. So rose petals is the object which is correlative. Eliot says there aren't sufficient objective correlatives in Hamlet that can tell Eliot, and of course I respect him deeply, my God, what's really bothering Hamlet, what's really annoying him. So the play's a failure. And meanwhile, by the way, my freshman year at college, I was playing Laertes in a production of Hamlet. And I wanted to play the role of Hamlet, but my roommate, Clark Gessner, got it. And he later went on to write You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown. But that was it. That's all he ever accomplished. We were best friends, but he got Hamlet. But I did what you would do. I tried to make Laertes as complicated as possible. And I was thrilled with this play. But here I'm going to class and I'm reading Eliot's essay. I can't reconcile the two. I don't have the ability. I'm a freshman. I get to graduate school. First course I take is a graduate seminar in Elizabethan revenge tragedy. And what you discover real quickly about Elizabethan revenge tragedy is there's a difference in quality sometimes, but they're all the same. Something happens before the play starts, the revenger finds out about this, and then the revenger enacts a revenge. He just doesn't go and kill the person who did something bad. He has to, like a playwright, create a situation which is theatrical. Let me give you the plot of a prototypical Elizabethan revenge play. Cyril Turner's The Revenger's Tragedy. staged the same year as Hamlet. In the Revenger's tragedy, Vindice, the Revenger, Italian for rival revenge, finds out that Duke Lassurioso has raped and murdered Vindice's fiancée before the play started. And so what Vindice does as a typical revenger is he disguises himself as a friar. He goes to the Duke and says, there is a woman that wants to have sex with you in the park at midnight. She'll be sitting on a park bench. She doesn't want to talk. Just go up to her and kiss her passionately on the lips and then have your will. And Lassurioso foams at the mouth at this idea. What Vindice does is, Vindice takes strychnine, takes the dead body of his fiancée, puts it on the park bench, puts strychnine on her lips, so when the Duke kisses her, he drops dead. Notice, the Revenger is like a playwright. There are two women Revengers in Elizabethan drama. He recreates the original situation, but changes the roles around. So the victim becomes the Revenger. That's the prototypical Elizabethan Revenger. But what I learned in that graduate seminar was, all those other Revengers except Hamlet, they don't do any thinking. The only thinking they do is how to devise the most artful revenge. They don't speculate on the meaning of action. They aren't intellectuals. And in fact, there was probably a Hamlet by some other playwright, which Shakespeare saw a couple years before he wrote his Hamlet. We can reconstruct this play, and it was most likely the prototypical Elizabethan revenge play. Of course, the thing is, Hamlet is unlike any other revenger, right? I mean, those other Elizabethan revenge plays, I suspect you read only as a graduate student. I mean, when's the last time any of us saw a production of the Revenger's tragedy, you know? Shakespeare's Hamlet is special. And so, having read that T.S. Eliot essay and not being able to dismiss it, but knowing my feelings about the play, and then as a graduate student finding out that Hamlet is unique, because Hamlet thinks so much, he delays. As Goethe said, Hamlet is a delicate goblet in which a hard rock has been placed. Hamlet Senior doesn't tell Hamlet to think. He says, just do. And here's Calderwood. Now I'm going to put it all together, I hope. Here's Calderwood calling Hamlet a messenger. Hamlet is in a play about messengers, in a play in which the playwright gives a name, Claudio, to a messenger who never appears on stage. Hamlet is a messenger of death. That's what his father says, deliver a death message to Claudius. And if Hamlet were Laertes, or if Hamlet were Fortinbras Jr., the play has 3 Revengers, no problem. Those 2 guys don't think, they just do. It's all that Claudius can do to hold back Laertes from murdering Hamlet. And Fortinbras has been coming into the play for the whole play, right? And it's all done for him anyway. Claudius is dead. Laertes and Fortinbras are conventional revengers, but Hamlet is an unconventional revenger. As Calderwood says, he's a messenger who opens the message, examines it. I have a student who's an international courier. She goes all over the world delivering messages, usually in a box or something like that. And we talk with each other about once a year. And she says, Sid, sometimes I know that I'm delivering drug money or military secrets, but or things that are illegal. She says, but that's not my job. Is not to examine the message. I just deliver it. And of course, the extraordinary thing about a messenger is, right, the moment the messenger delivers the messenger ceases to be. Here's the messenger, A, has to go to B. The moment he delivers the message, the job description, it's over. But what about if you had a messenger who peeks into the message? That intrigued me. You give him 7 soliloquies. In fact, he's a lousy revenger, isn't he? When he finally gets his revenge, you know what happens. Claudius has arranged the sword fight between the 2 guys. Laertes' rapier is tipped with poison, and that's going to do it. That's Claudius's revenge. Claudius is a typical revenger. Let's add him to the cast. And you know what happens? The guys are fighting on stage. They drop their swords. They pick up the wrong one. Hamlet nicks Laertes. Laertes drops dead. Hamlet suddenly goes, oh my, oy vey, it was meant for me, right? And I love the ending of that play. Hamlet grabs the goblet, and in one of the worst lines Shakespeare writes, yes, he can write some bad lines. Here, thou murderous, incestuous, damned Dane, is thy union here, drink this. But unfortunately, Gertrude has just finished the rest of the goblet, so there's no poison. So Hamlet stabs him. When Hamlet finally does what his father asked him to do, when Richard Burbage, playing Hamlet, finally asked what his playwright, William Shakespeare, playing Hamlet Sr., wrote for him to do, it's just freaky. It's an accident. It's the clumsiest of all revenges. It's as if revenge is not the ultimate issue of the play. When we were in the People's Republic of China, I was about to do a production of Hamlet, but I was called before a committee of party officials. This was back in the 80s. A year before Tiananmen Square. And the party officials said, seriously to me, Homan, is Hamlet ultimately about revenge? And I said, why do you ask that? And this one wonderful bureaucrat says, we do not have a problem with revenge in the People's Republic of China. I answered him honestly. I said, no, I myself don't think it's ultimately about revenge. I like to watch the TV show Criminal Minds. I love that. But that's a very different sort of pleasure than watching Hamlet. So this led to me to a wonderful failure, and I'm going to end with a failure and an invitation from Norma. I staged Hamlet some years back, in which Hamlet not only looked at his message, but looked too closely, and Hamlet realized he was in a play. The audience were bored to tears. There was no emotion there. No more genuine emotion than you have when you kiss someone on stage as part of your character. I mean, the kiss may be pleasurable, but it's not the same as a real kiss. I learned my lesson.